Human culture thrives when discussions about what is true, what is just, and what is beautiful is remembered as an ongoing, never-ending, never-complete conversation.
To quote Milton, by the known rules of ancient liberty, welcome to Risky Conversations. I am your co-host, Ember Sadat. Join me and my co-host, Ace Deliri, as we engage in this ancient tradition of discussions around interesting topics with utterly fascinating people.
Welcome to Risky Conversations. Michael, please introduce yourself to our listeners.
So my name's Michael Bonner. I've done a lot of, wild and weird things in life, but I am a historian of Persia, an independent historian. I did my 2 higher degrees at Oxford. I began academic life as a classicist, but was always fascinated by the history of Iran from the time of the Achaemenid Empire and the Empire of Cyrus and so forth, all the way up to post-Islamic times and the poetry of Hafez and Molavi and so forth. But I did my master's and doctorate on the history of the Sasanian Empire, the empire of Iran right before the Arab conquest and the coming of Islam. A very understudied subject, and I wanted a challenge, so I did it. However, in real life, I'm not affiliated with any academic institution. I'm actually a policy advisor within the government of Ontario. I live in Toronto with my wife and 2 sons.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for coming on. We love people who have done weird and strange things in life because they have the best stories to tell. So let's start with your interest in Iran. How did that even spring up? Because you don't usually hear a Canadian person having any kind of interest. Usually they have interest in medieval history, or they usually have an interest in American history. But how did the love for Persia come out for you?
Well, that's a good question. I would say that I was very fortunate as a boy in school, being introduced to a good deal of very ancient history. When I was in, grade 4 and 5, we were introduced to sort of like prehistoric archaeology and anthropology, and then, sort of plunged into the early history of civilization and the agricultural revolution and so forth. And of course, that quickly gets us into the sort of early historical empires of, Assyria and Babylon and, Sumeria. I think I've got those in reverse order, but, Sumeria was first, and then, we get Assyria and Babylon. And of course, the great Persian Empire, established by Cyrus the Great, was the sort of center of civilized life for a very long time, and what we think of as the beginnings of Western history, with this sort of Greek city-states and eventually the conquests of Alexander the Great and the appearance of the Roman Empire and so forth. All of that is actually peripheral to what was really the center, as I said, what was really the center of civilized life, that it was Persia. It was the Achaemenid Empire that was the model of, of a well-ordered state, good laws, a powerful military, and the writers, Greek writers like Herodotus and Thucydides, I think, are very evidently in awe of it, and being introduced to Near Eastern history and the history of Greece and Rome and the Mediterranean world. Really, you can't really study those things unless you study Persia. And for me, that was the most fascinating angle of it. And it never really left. I eventually went into classical studies and I did Latin and Greek throughout school and then in university. But it was always Persia that was the most interesting part of it, and that has stayed with me.
Right. And I was just in preparation for our conversation, but I did look into the Persian Empire pre the Islamic. I guess you would call it. What would you call that when they kind of merged and brought in some of the ideas that kind of stifled what I found to be the most beautiful aspect of ancient Persia, My question to you is this. I mean, given the massive influence of it, because I was just looking into their history and how far and wide their influence spread, how is it that an empire that well-founded in the sense of how, they manage their government, their laws and all that, how do they actually fall into the invasion by the Arabs? What was it that precipitated I'm sure it was multiple stages, but what are some of the key highlights that allowed that to happen? Because it's always been a fascinating concept for me to look into.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's also a very good question, and of course it's bound up with questions of Iranian identity and even like the last 20th century king of Iran, his notion of 2,000 years of Iranian kingship, and of course the Islamic Republic is has a fundamentally different idea of what constitutes Iranian identity. The key fact is, looking at the fall of the pre-Islamic Iranian Empire, is that the Arab conquest was as surprising then. When we have to cast our minds back to the to the 7th century and earlier, in order to get into the facts. What we're dealing with is two great world empires, Persia and Rome, who had existed far beyond what any living person could have remembered, as far as anybody would have been concerned at the time, that Persia and Rome were they had always been there and they were destined to be there forever. Their two biggest external threats would have been basically nomads from the world of the steppe. Everyone knows about the Germanic barbarians who overthrew Rome, and many people have heard of the Huns. Those threats were far more serious along the northeastern frontier of the Iranian Empire. So, most of the efforts of defending these two places went into, the sort of northeastern fronts. And the idea that Arabs were sort of an existential threat would never have occurred to anyone. Or if it had occurred, it would not have been considered anywhere near as serious as the more dangerous nomads coming from the steppe. So I think that there's an element of the sort of unforeseen, the sort of randomness of history that comes in here. But we're also dealing with two powers who were at war most of the time. Rome and Persia were almost constantly fighting, and the context in which Islam appears is one in which the two have basically exhausted one another's resources and military power. Iran had finished a massive military effort which saw almost the complete conquest of the Roman Empire. The Romans were, they were able to reverse that relatively quickly, but at great cost to themselves. And to cut a long story short, the Arabs, who were, largely uninvolved in that conflict, were able to take advantage of a weakened weakened border area, weakened security in the sort of southern flanks of those two empires. And by the time they crossed into the region of the Persian capital, in the vicinity of modern Baghdad, incidentally, there was very little stopping them. And you had a situation in which Persia and Rome are exhausted, they're humiliated, their military forces are greatly reduced, and several kings and queens in rapid succession had come and gone from the Iranian throne, there was really very little resistance that could be met. And once the capital was taken, there was resistance for a long time, but as long as the capital was conquered, there was really no turning back. So that's a long story short. You're going to have to read the full book when it finally comes out. But that's it in a nutshell.
Fair enough. So the question I have for you on this front is, what was the reason why the Persians and the Romans were in conflict with each other? It seems like they share a lot of common ideas. I guess and now they do, because some of the ideas have merged together. But at the time that they were at war with each other, was it just a land grab situation, or is it an ego situation, or was it just like there was fundamental philosophical differences between the two empires?
Another deep question. Well, I think we should take that in reverse order.
Okay.
In a sense, there were fundamental philosophical differences. That the power centered in the Mediterranean, long before there were any Romans who could, or long before there was any Roman Empire, the power centered in the Mediterranean was the Macedonian, the conquests of Alexander the Great were quickly encroaching further and further east into the Achaemenid Empire, founded by Cyrus, the first Persian Empire, and the rest is cliché. The rest is history. But the fact is that the conquest of the first Persian Empire by Alexander the Great is what brought the Mediterranean world face to face with the Iranian one, and the Romans, the Roman Empire basically inherited that situation. And by the time of, say, the Emperor Augustus, who established the fall of the Roman Republic and the reign of the Emperor Augustus, which is the beginning of the imperial period, you have the Roman world centered in the Mediterranean, and then you have the so-called Parthian Empire centered on the Iranian plateau, who are basically sharing, they're basically sharing a border, or at least with overlapping spheres of influence, with some notable exceptions, but for the most part, they're sharing spheres of influence, or they're overlapping from the Caucasus in the north, right down into the Arabian Peninsula in the south. And there are some local kings maybe who are some of them are subject to Iran, some of them are subject to Rome, but eventually these little kingdoms all get swallowed up, and you have the two great powers face to face along a very poorly defined border. And in history, that kind of a situation is almost always going to lead to conflict and warfare, and it did in this case. And you have basically the two powers facing off, trying to gain the smallest possible advantage. A little bit of territory here, a little bit there. Trying to exert more and more influence over places like Armenia and Georgia, winning over one Arab tribe or another. You have that situation basically going nonstop for hundreds of years until there are outbreaks of outright war. And one power is basically determined to, if not actually to destroy the other one, then to extract whatever advantage it possibly can. Now, the fascinating thing, for me anyway, is that the two powers, Rome and Iran, throughout really most of their history, they're basically evenly matched. That they're the two great superpowers of the day. That there's not really any hope of one totally destroying the other. And as much as it would have been hard for one or the other to acknowledge having an equal in the world, eventually they had to. And the Roman emperor had to admit that the Persian king was his equal, and that and the same the other way around. So amidst these conflicts, you do have periods of cooperation as well, and the cooperation was usually provoked or necessitated by mutual threats. Whenever the two powers were more seriously threatened by external enemies, it was more likely that they were going to cooperate. And as I alluded before, nomads coming from Inner Asia, such as the Huns or the Turks, eventually, such forces were far more threatening to the two powers than either was to the other. So you do have some cooperation there as well.
So you said you chose to study the Sasanian Empire because it was rarely studied before. Was there anything that you learned while studying this topic that made you feel like you made the right decision?
Well, yeah. First, I would say if you like languages, as I do, you're going to have to know a lot of them to study Sasanian Persia. So it's a good, it was a good adventure for me, since I was not, I was always fascinated by history, but I was not originally a historian. I was originally a classicist, and then I learned languages like Arabic and Persian and eventually Armenian, and you need to have a good arsenal to understand the sources, and that was kind of fun. But the truth is that one of the most fascinating things is that I found when I was studying this subject, it was like revealing that or at least virtually all the old assumptions about it were just completely wrong. I mean, people used to think that the Sasanian Empire was virtually empty, that it was like somehow underpopulated and horribly impoverished, and that they had no skill or whatever, and that they had to keep importing Roman prisoners of war to keep the population high or whatever. And that's just nonsense. Ideas like that were repeated well into the 20th century, and it's just rubbish. There were other old ideas like the Iranian Empire could never really, it didn't have much military infrastructure, or like they didn't even have their own currency. So, and that's why they had to keep, extracting tribute from Rome and things like that. It's just nonsense. And I'll give you one example of one example that proves that all that stuff is wrong. So that the Sasanian currency, the silver dram of the Persian Empire, never wavered. That the amount of silver in it hardly changed over the course of 450 years.
Wow.
Which means that the purity of the silver, to me anyway, suggests that you have a very strong centralized government that is maintaining unwaveringly strict control over the money system in a way that is just completely unknown in the Roman Empire. That the emperors are constantly debasing or devaluing the gold currency, that the gold solidus. They're shaving off bits of it, or like introducing some alloy into it. And that's just a fiscal system. That's a fiscal system that is just out of control. And there is no parallel to that in the Iranian world. You have a much more powerful centralized state. Iranian coins are found all over the world, deep into China, and there's no doubt about what kind of a state is suggested by that sort of evidence. And another thing I would point out is the idea of military infrastructure. The so-called Great Wall of Gorgon, which stretches from, it's now mostly in ruins, but it was built from the shore of the Caspian Sea into the mountains through the region called Gorgon. That was the second biggest military wall in the entire world, like after the walls in China, right? And it would have had these fortresses along it, and in each fortress you could have easily kept like 40,000 men and horses and things like that. The idea that this is a serious empire with massive fiscal and military resources to draw on, and it's organizing infrastructure projects on a gigantic scale. There's no parallel for that sort of thing in Rome on such a scale. So to go back to the original question, the Sasanian Empire that I discovered and learned about is really a fundamentally different kind of place than what is commonly described in textbooks or in even in academic circles. It's a much stronger, much better organized, military and cultural power that can, more than hold its own against Rome and Imperial China. And for me, that was quite exciting.
Yeah, you know what? As you're speaking, like my mind's racing because I have like a million things I want to ask up and follow up. So I just want to give some context to our listeners about Michael's point about the silver currency not being devalued. That is such a crucial point because I'll give you two examples of where that applies. Typically, from my cursory understanding of history, and again, Michael's the expert here, but from what I've read, typically empires or kings, don't really know how to manage money well. So what they end up doing is they shave off the coins, like he said, or they add cheaper metals to keep the supply bigger, so that they can continue to pay their army to go in and invade and whatever conquest they're participating in. To be able to achieve the ability to maintain a pure silver at a high level for that 400-year period is something astounding, because even to this day, there's an application of it where we look at something like Bitcoin, which most people are somewhat familiar with. The reason most people aren't spending it as currency and actually holding on to it as a store of value is for the same reason, right? So if you had an old silver coin that was initially minted in the Sasanian Empire, and you looked at that and said, hey, given my understanding of history, I can tell that this particular emperor is going to devalue this currency, so I'm just going to hold this and not really spend it. That way, I know that when future iterations of it come out and there's less silver in them, I have a higher quality coin to hold on to. So therefore, I'll just not spend it. That's what's happening with Bitcoin. So that's why it's not becoming a transactional medium, because it's becoming a storage of value medium. So this point is massive in the sense that if you can appreciate the nuance of what's going on in that particular fiscal responsible point of view, and to maintain that for 400 years is astounding. The second thing I wanted to ask is, right? Because that's not, even today in current modern day age, all the governments you look around the world, something like Zimbabwe would have 1,000,000% inflation. And they've been in power, 30, 40 years? Mugabe, 50 years, I believe it was.
Yep.
But the thing that made it fascinating for me with regards to what you're saying here is, like, I'm reminded of Breaking Bad and Walter White's concept of we're in the empire business. So I wanted to ask a historian this kind of question because I've always been fascinated with it, is how do you start an empire? It seems like you're just like a dude starting up a gang and then just swallowing up other gangs and eventually just becoming the biggest gang in the yard. Considering history's proclivity for extreme violence, would that be an accurate description of it, or is that too simplistic a view?
No, I agree, actually, because, you know, first of all, we should never underestimate the, like just the sheer level of violence in history, and the amount of the amount of warfare, even by the standards of the 20th century, is astounding. If you ask me, that there are very few exceptions when the two powers were not engaged in some sort of mortal struggle. So, imagine the First World War and the Second World War, just sort of being reenacted, every 30 or 40 years and lasting even longer. It's like they're fighting virtually all the time, and obviously the scale of killing in the 20th century is like that was sort of new and exacerbated by technology. But considering the fact that you've got two big empires who have large populations, and who are dependent mostly on rents from land or agricultural production. The amount of resources that are going into just like maintaining an army and beating up your enemies, it's quite astounding. So when a new dynasty comes to power in Iran, you also have to factor in, the old one will get killed off. That's, pretty much a given. So there's a considerable amount of violence. But so
you're saying there's no smooth, peaceful transition of power? There's no votes and democratic processes?
No. Alas, no.
Okay.
And even within, the Sasanian dynasty itself, it's the reign of each particular king was not always uncontested, right? Mm-hmm. So and that was the same in the Roman world too. That although they didn't really have dynastic rule in the Roman Empire, but basically whoever could maintain the loyalty of the military was destined to keep his throne. That's more or less the case. In the Persian world, you also have the fact of a handful of very powerful and old aristocratic families who usually have hereditary roles within the empire, and whose support is necessary in order for a king to maintain his power. But let's go back to the beginning of the Sasanian state. So what makes the Sasanian state unusual is that it has, as far as all the sources say, it has a very strong religious foundation. So there's a potent ideological element, and what we're talking about here is the Zoroastrian religion, which goes back a long way. It's like a kind of reformed version of the old Indo-European religion attributed to the prophet Zoroaster, and it's a matter of considerable debate whether Zoroaster even existed, and if so, when. But by the time we're into the Sasanian period, it's pretty much given that the Zoroastrian religion goes back to a priest who was living in what is now called Afghanistan, who taught a doctrine of what we would call radical dualism, that there are two rival gods, one Ahura Mazda, who is responsible for the creation of everything that is good, and another one called Angra Mainyu, who is responsible for everything bad, and the two are engaged in a constant struggle, and humanity has to pick a side. So according to the prophet Zoroaster, we've got to be on the side of Ahura Mazda and eventually prevail and so forth. Zoroastrianism gives us the concept of it actually introduces what would have been a revolutionary notion of time, that time is divided into cycles, that it has a beginning and an end, and that the end is very similar to the Christian or Islamic idea of an apocalypse and the end of the world and a last judgment.
Right.
All that kind of thing, in principle, goes back to Zoroastrianism. So, and there are other elements that are more or less well known. The veneration of fire, for example, fire temples, veneration of other elements like water and earth and so forth. But precisely exactly what else Zoroastrian would have believed is sometimes not really clear or up for debate. But this was the faith of the founder of the Sasanian dynasty. His name was Ardashir. It's the name Artaxerxes, or the name that we call Artaxerxes. Is
that the guy they made the movie about?
Yes, played by I think a Native American actor.
Right.
Very, very peculiar, very peculiar treatment of history, that film, The 300. But yeah, that's the guy.
Okay.
So, or was it Xerxes? I can't remember. I saw the film.
I think it was Xerxes.
Maybe it was Xerxes.
Yeah.
So different guy.
Okay.
But yeah, people should not take the 300 film as a as a sort of faithful recreation of real history.
Right.
So what is different is this ideological foundation, this idea that the new dynasty founded by Ardashir has a religious element. That is a new idea, and this comes long before, or maybe not long before. It's a good 100 years before the appearance of Constantine the Great, and the idea of a Christian Roman Empire. So long before that kind of notion, the idea that the Roman state has an ideology or whatever, the Iranian state has one. That this new ruler has established, or maybe even in his mind reestablished the national religion of the Iranian people, and that he's recreated a much older idea of Persian kingship and statecraft and empire, and that with the ideological mix, with the religious mix, it's a far more potent force and a far more aggressive opponent to the Roman Empire. And it basically, I think that it basically set the example for the changes that eventually took place within the Roman state, making Christianity the official religion and that sort of thing. So to summarize that, you basically have a new dynasty established through civil war, killing off the old one, establishing a far more powerful centralized monarchy with a new religious component and an ideology to back it up.
Okay, so why is it called Iran and not still Persia?
That's a good question. So the origin of the word Iran is the same word that comes up in the in Sanskrit as Aryan, Aryan. So Iran was once pronounced Iran or Iran, and it occurs in the Zoroastrian holy book, the Avesta, as a geographical term, the so-called Arianem Vaejo, which means the abode of the Aryan people. And this goes back to, mythical prehistoric times of a group of people who came from Central Asia, or somewhere in Central Eurasia, and eventually, populated the Indian subcontinent and the Iranian plateau. And you find within the Hindu Vedas, as well as in the Avesta, you find this reference to some kind of theoretical or mythical homeland of the ancient Aryans. So the name of Ardashir's empire, the Sasanian state, was some version of the phrase Iran Shah, which means the Iranian Empire, or like Iran Shah or something like that. And Shah is you can probably correct my pronunciation, but that's still the modern word for like a city or a town, right?
Right. Right. Yep. Absolutely.
But it's ancient meaning. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay. No. Because I was going to say, this is what always throws me off, right? So you got the Iranian Aryan conversation going. Now, people hear that and they automatically think Hitler and his Aryan race conversation. Are those things linked?
Well, the Nazis kind of ruined it for everybody. But,
as they did with pretty much everything they did.
Yeah, exactly. So these, I don't know if let me put it this way. If there's any truth to the myth of the idea of the Aryanem Vaejo, or like in Sanskrit it's called Airavarta, I think. Okay. Some Sanskritologist listening can correct me. But if there's any truth to that myth, I think what we're really talking about is a linguistic group.
Okay.
And that the speakers of whoever these people were, they spoke what linguists call something like Proto-Indo-European. Okay. Nobody uses the phrase Aryan language anymore. We talk about Indo-European or Proto-Indo-European, which are basically languages like Persian, Sanskrit, modern Hindi, Latin, Greek, Armenian, and all the languages of Europe, with the exception of things like Hungarian or Basque or stuff like that. English is an Indo-European language too, and they all have words in common. And in English we say father. In German you say Vater. In Latin pater, and of course in Persian pedar. Right? It all sounds kind of similar. So there are a lot of words like that, and they all have a common origin. So if there's any truth to this, it's probably mostly a linguistic one. But there's also a religious element, that this idea of the homeland, the Aryanem Vaejo, that supposedly was written by Zoroaster himself in the Zoroastrian holy book, and it implies a country where the true religion revealed by Zoroaster was originally practiced, and where notions of good government and political order and proper social order and everything like that first developed. So and it's a myth. I don't know if anyone can actually locate where this place was supposed to be. But when when Ardashir establishes his new empire and he calls it Iran Shah, I think that he's invoking this mythical religious idea, and sort of establishing his monarchy as the earthly counterpart to, or at least the real revival of the ancient mythical, political and religious order described by Zoroaster, if that makes any sense. So we can throw away all the crap made up by the Nazis and focus on Zoroaster instead.
Happily to do so. So the question I always had is, this is just a technical conversation. I mean, I'm a person who studied, engineering, and then I studied finance and whatnot. But how do you, what establishes somebody with the rights to call themselves a historian? Like, for example, you did say you weren't affiliated with any kind of university. So
Yeah.
what, for our listeners who have never, we've heard of historians, but it's sort of like a abstract concept. What gives somebody the right to call themselves that, and how do you become quote unquote an accredited historian? And considering what you've told us, in the sense that you have discovered a way to look at the history of this particular empire in a way that's completely different from, I would imagine, your contemporaries. How does all that mesh together? I imagine historians aren't like this unified group of people who all agree on everything. But what's
No.
the actual process like? So how do you walk us through, people who've never delved into that world? What's the process like? Like, how do you become a historian? How do you become a accredited historian? How do people become discredited as historians? Because somebody could just sit there and be like, oh, I read these 50 books from this corner that nobody's read, and therefore this is the true history. And so you're like, how do you evaluate and weigh the pros and cons of each person's perspective? Because as we know, history is just basically a first draft, right?
Well, yeah. I mean, history. So what I would say, first of all, is that the idea that you have to have some kind of accreditation or whatever, I just think is nonsense. I mean,
Agreed.
That it's just none of the great figures who wrote history that people would instantly think of when they think of history with a capital H, like Herodotus or Thucydides or Sima Qian in the case of ancient China, or someone like Tabari or Dinawari or Masudi or whatever. None of these people had university degrees.
Right.
None of them had a piece of paper that said they're historians. So the idea that you have to have some particular kind of academic formation, I think, is highly questionable.
Mm-hmm.
Although it probably helps a little bit. But, I look at a guy like Tom Holland, who is an independent writer and historian who I think is eminently readable, very easy to understand, who presents novel ideas and sometimes shocking ones, whilst still sticking very much to historical sources and anchoring his argument in historical texts. He is a great historian, but he's not an academic one. He does have an academic training in the classics, I believe, but not he doesn't have a university post. So there's no reason to insist upon having one in order to take a historian seriously. But to go back to the previous example of old ancient historians, like Herodotus and Thucydides and so forth. That I'll reference a little paragraph from the historian Polybius. Polybius, who wrote the rise, he wrote a history of the rise of the Roman Empire. He himself was of Greek origin, and he wrote in Greek, but he describes in at considerable length, I might add, the rise of the Roman Empire. He says that history he says that history will never be right, or the writing of history will never be good or proper unless people with experience in human affairs and politics actually write it, because that's the only way you can actually understand the facts of history, especially if you're writing, like political or military affairs. You have to have some experience of these things, because I would say because human nature hasn't really changed very much. You have to be in the game in order to understand it better. So I would say that in this respect, academic historians are at a distinct disadvantage. That they're not really immersed in human affairs. They're observing the affairs of their own day at a considerable distance in many cases. And it's kind of unfair maybe to generalize, but I'm going to do it anyway, that they probably have a weak grasp of how political decisions are made. They probably don't understand how an important politician, or a king or an emperor or whatever would take a decision, or how advice would be brought to him, and that sort of thing. So I think that does hamper their understanding of the past. And of course, very few of us have ever been in a battle or anything like that. So, understanding how military affairs would be decided or undertaken or executed is another matter altogether. What I do, I work in politics. I'm an advisor. I've done this for almost a decade. I would say that apart from my background as a linguist, and apart from just taking an interest in reading sources, that having a political background has helped enormously in understanding history, and in getting a sense of just how a state would be run or managed, or what kind of political decisions a ruler would be faced with, how to manage the expectations of a hostile opposition, or a group of critics at court or whatever. Obviously we're not dealing with any kind of a democratic state, so no one would have cared what a ruler would not have cared necessarily what ordinary people would have thought about anything, not necessarily until maybe popular opinion became completely unmanageable, or in the case of an outright revolt. But politics is fundamentally the game of us versus them, to put it as crudely as possible, and I don't think that has ever changed. So I'm definitely on the side of Polybius, who thinks that history is only ever going to be good when men of action write it. So that's what I try to do. But I think there was another part of your question. It was about like who gets to be a historian,
right?
So I would still emphasize the same point, that really the historians that I rely on the most from the past, and the historians whom I think are the best, were themselves involved in the affairs of their day. So like Procopius. Procopius is the great historian of the age of the Emperor Justinian, who who devotes a lot of his work to the Persian king Khosrow Anushirvan and his father Qobad or Kavad the First. He himself was the secretary and a kind of political advisor to the general Belisarius. He would have had access to all sorts of state papers. He would have seen his boss in action. He would have been witness to many of the battles that he describes. He's not always reliable. He's not always truthful. There are many instances where it's possible to find fault with Procopius, but I would take an imperfect or a liar, like a lying eyewitness, who over an armchair academic, any day. And even in the case of someone like Thucydides, who is supposedly he's often thought of as like the father of scientific history, or like the first serious historical writer. He himself was a general during the Peloponnesian War who failed. He failed in his mission, and he was forced into exile. But he wrote his history, which was written 2,500 years ago, is still read today. So even a military or political failure, I think, can still do a better job than a professor.
Fair. I mean, the reason I bring that up is because, unfortunately, the public education I was exposed to in Canada sort of takes the joy out of history, in the sense it's always like, thus date, this happened, this guy, that guy, right? And so it totally turns most people off history. So it's kind of like math. It's so poorly taught. The rich tapestry of people's emotions and the reactions to it are so stripped from the data that's pushed and presented to the people. Because I guess I kind of understand why they do that, because if you're going to evaluate a student's comprehension of history, you kind of have to ask them on what they did, what happened, right? So you can't really expect them to, like, I thoroughly fell in love with history all over again when I read The Guns of August by Barbara Tuchman. Right? So when I read works from somebody like that, and they kind of show you, okay, here's how these things precipitate, here's the chain of events that lead to this, and here's what this person at the time was under the impression that this was happening. And then you read something like Neville Chamberlain constantly appeasing Hitler, and all he keeps coming back with is there will be peace in our time. And in retrospect, you look back at it and say, look, well, this person was clearly fooling themselves, if not anybody else. And then you contrast that with somebody like Joseph Goebbels, who, if the Nazis had prevailed, he would have written history in a much different way, because for him, the perspective of history was to capture it on film and to create a propaganda narrative to speak to the future generations. And then yet you look back now and you see that people are still in denial of lots of things that happened, like, for example, the denial of the Holocaust. So history gets lost in translation. History gets lost because the meaning and joy and beauty and tragedy of it is stripped off of it. And so that's why I was really excited to have a conversation with you, because it's like, okay, I've never really met somebody who's in this business who passionately cares about it. So how do you navigate that world? Like, what's that world really like?
Well,
you know what I mean?
Yeah. So chronology and even facts are obvious. They're very important in history, but that's not all there is. They are not all there is. And it seems sort of ridiculously obtuse, but the question, what is history, is going to be answered differently by different people. And I can tell you that one of the main distinctions, or if not the main distinction, is going to be whether you think that history is a kind of collection of facts surrounded by a layer of interpretation,
Okay.
or a collection of interpretations surrounded by a layer of facts. And that may seem silly, but the truth is that when a historian, even an eyewitness historian, sits down to write anything about what happened, what he believes are the facts are still going to have some element of interpretation mixed in. So a historian is going to have to ask himself whether he thinks that, like what is going, what is the largest part going into the mixture, right?
Okay.
Because simply a list of facts like are arranged in chronological order, that would not be history. There has to be an element. There has to be some other element. And a lot of us would say that it's something like, the linkage of cause and effect, some level of analysis or interpretation, maybe even bias. These things are all, mixed in one way or the other. And when a lot of us are presented with history in school, all we are told and all that is expected of us is that, we're supposed to get the facts in the right order, the right chronological order. And that's not what I'm saying is that that's really not it. That's not all there is to it. And in many the further back you go in history, you're often faced with a problem with you're faced with the problem that you don't really know what the facts are. That it's either a matter of conjecture or some kind of like scholarly consensus based on conjecture or something, or nobody really has any idea. So to illustrate this point, we can take something like the history of ancient Egypt. The history of ancient Egypt is actually relatively well documented in terms of the length of the length of various rulers' reigns, and we have a relatively strong chronology. Okay. Right. It can't really be verified externally for the most part, but we have lists of kings, and we have, roughly how long they reigned, and we have a pretty good idea of when things started and when they stopped. So that's, that's chronology right there. That's basically almost as good as it gets, looking at very, very ancient history. Right. But exactly what happened, in each reign or during each dynasty or whatever, that's not always clear. In fact, I would say most of the time it isn't clear at all. However, to complicate matters, I guess even more, is that when you look at the archaeological record, you can find evidence of, maybe war or building activity, or you can discover like large cemeteries or something and get a sense of like, the economic class of the people you find there in terms of grave goods or whatever. So you can get a sense of like demographic changes, or the relative affluence of society or different social classes at the time. But getting down to things like like what kind of decisions were taken at what time by what king, or what his officials did, or how much it rained, or who the king's friends were, or what he ate for dinner, like that sort of stuff. That sort of stuff is completely mysterious most of the time. So again, I would ask sort of obtusely or rhetorically, like, is that history? We have the chronology, we have kind of an overview of what happened in huge outline, but something else is missing. There's like another element. We can't really, in this context, we can't really explain a lot of the time why anything happened, and we don't, and that's because we don't have enough evidence. Right. So like that's not that. So that doesn't really, even though you can kind of tell the story, or you can sort of get a sense of what was going on. It's debatable whether that's real history. On the other hand, you have something like the history of the Peloponnesian War by Thucydides, which is very detailed. He organizes everything by year, and then he breaks down the years in terms of like summer and winter, and he's got a lot of very perceptive analysis, and he's all about cause and effect. Everything is explained in entirely human terms. There's no recourse to divine intervention or whatever, mysterious, like magical forces or whatever. It's nothing like that. But there's no alternative to Thucydides, right? There's for the most part, there's no other source that tells the story. Right? There's a bit of archaeology that we have, and sometimes it actually contradicts him.
Right. Like you said earlier before.
Yeah.
They're going to lie, obviously, because human perception, bias, and whatnot.
That's right. So sometimes it turns out that he's wrong, but for the most part, we can neither verify nor corroborate it. So if you were a scholar or a student or whatever, if you just took Thucydides and then repeated everything he says and then published your own book in your own words, would that be history? I would say no, it's not.
Right.
So like that's the opposite problem, where it looks like you have all the facts and all the interpretation you need in order to tell a story. But if you're just going to repeat, or you're forced into a position where you can only repeat the story that you have because you have no competing account, you're not writing history either. So I'm kind of giving you a roundabout, long-winded answer, but the ideal situation to be in, I think, as a historian, would be one in which you've got a large body of historical evidence in different languages from different cultures, all of which have not influenced one another, and they're not all drawing on the same material, and they're all talking about the same period or the same events.
Okay.
So that you can look at so that you can get a sense of how different groups or different people are looking at the same thing, and I would say that if they agree on the facts of the case and cause and effect or whatever, I would say that that's as good as it gets in history, and that's probably the truth. If not, then you have to look for some other interpretation, or find the one amongst those that you have that you think is right. And of course, they could all be wrong too. So
of course. So what I find interesting with what you're saying here, and this is why, like, one of my main purposes of having this conversation with you is to sort of dispel the idea that history is boring. And I actually think history is one of the most fascinating subjects to study, because it doesn't really have a place, in the sense, like, it's not a science. So it's not trying to tell you, oh, here's how you predict where the moon will be 15 years from now. It's not, it's not economic policy. It's not trying to doctrine, this math equation leads to this, so go do that. And it's kind of recounting a tale, but it has a dual purpose to it. And what I mean by that is and I'm a big fan of Hafiz. And what I found interesting with his works was that he memorized bits and parts of his culture, so that when the Islamic influence comes in, that part isn't forgotten. So it wasn't necessarily to tell a tale of this king on this period, on this emperor did this. It's more like, here's how we as a people culturally appreciated that which was around us. And so when the new rulers come in, they don't get to erase the history of that which was here before. Right? So again, if you look at it that way, history is sort of this beautiful gem that you can't really put on any crown because there's no place for it. It's just sort of this abstract layer that needs a much deeper and richer understanding of it, so that you don't just dismiss it as some quote unquote boring subject in school.
Yeah,
would you agree with that?
I would in principle. I would add two things though.
Okay.
First of all, it sounds kind of basic, but I think it needs to be emphasized that people have to decide whether they think that it's actually possible to know anything about the past.
Mm-hmm.
Like, obviously, I believe that it is.
Right.
But there's a whole, there's a movement now associated with postmodernism that would suggest that, you can't, that there's no, that it's not possible to get any kind of certainty out of a historical source or a collection of historical sources because I'm not sure I really understand their reasoning, but the idea that the narrative created by the author of an historical text is just, like a creation of his own mind, or that it's subject to the distortions of the interests of a particular class or political group or something like that, and that the truth is better found in smaller narratives that have not been recorded. To me, I think that's kind of a strange way of thinking, because obviously, obviously most historical sources are not going to be focused on, day-to-day life, or, what a peasant that no one has ever heard of had for dinner, or, whether he liked, whether he liked walking or riding horses more. I don't know why that would feature in an historical source.
Right.
What the discipline that we call history evolved to be, at least originally, it evolved in such a manner that it was focused mostly on what we would call politics and warfare. That
right.
The idea of social history is a newer development. The idea of focusing on daily life. Occasionally you see books or like television programs, called like Daily Life in Ancient Rome or whatever. Like that's not what would have been understood. Like the word history would not have been understood to include that sort of thing long ago. So I'm of the view that when you look at your source, you have to assume that there's something you can get out of it. That it's not just a kind of interpretative framework from the past that is actually concealing more than it reveals. I don't agree with that. I think that we should reject that idea in favor of a more open-minded notion of what sources can tell you. So I actually take that quite far. So I look at texts like the Shahnameh of Ferdowsi, and a large part of that text deals with the Sasanian Empire.
Right.
And it's written, for those who don't know, it's a long poem. It's the Iranian national epic. It's a very well regarded piece of Persian literature that would not normally be considered a work of history. But I think that there are parts of it which include a large amount of historical truth, and I've demonstrated that in my earlier books, and I've used it for my upcoming book on Sasanian history as best I can. Which is not to say that it's always going to be accurate, but there are historical elements of it which I think reflect genuine genuine facts from the past. But the only way we would know that is if we look at a historical source, we read it, we compare it to other sources, and we weigh it against the facts that we find from other texts, and something that I would call the balance of probability, or just common sense.
Right.
And often there are good things that you can extract from unlikely sources. So that's the first thing. Can we actually learn anything about the past, for certain? I think we can.
Mm-hmm.
However, in that long train of thought, I can't remember what else you asked. What was the other question?
Well, so what I asked was in a sense, the purpose of history is not always to record events and facts. Sometimes it's to just record a cultural phenomenon, so that when the new empire invades, that the old culture isn't erased. Because
right.
The reason I bring that up is because the person who cemented that concept for me was Orwell. And if you read his collected essays, which I'm a big fan of, and of course 1984 and whatnot, the whole principle is, if you get people to forget what happened before you came around, and you tell them how things are, then you get to control entirely how they will behave. So, and the purpose of it, and I'll tell you an example of that from my country, in Afghanistan, when my parents fled and my uncles and everybody else was involved, they took everybody's deeds for the lands they owned, so that nobody could claim what belonged to them for how long, whichever generations. And these things are generationally passed down from one family to the next. And they also took away records of people's accomplishments in education, so that if they were to travel abroad, they couldn't claim to be a trained doctor or a trained engineer, because they didn't want the proof to be out there. So in essence, part of erasing history is to cement your version of what you want people to do. So to me, I take it very personally when people come and as you stated, this postmodernist approach of eliminating history as a source of truth. And I think it's very Orwellian in nature, in a sense that it's trying something insidious, in the sense like it's, the person who is in charge is the oppressor and history is his narrative. And I'm like, there's always a layer of that that's true, but to turn that as the only truth is to miss everything else that comes with it. And so that's simply why I was talking and referencing Hafiz, because from what I gathered, his perspective on the invasion of the Islamic Arabs into Persia was to maintain the love of wine and poetry and music and astronomy that was prevalent in ancient Persia, which I am also open to being corrected upon, because obviously I have limited exposure to it. But so to tie that back into what you were stating, was that history has dual purposes in most cases. Half of it is to record an event, the other half is to make sure that the cultural context isn't erased by whatever comes in that's new. So it doesn't allow modernity to erase ancient history.
Right. So let's go back to the Shahnameh.
Okay.
I think that this perfectly illustrates the truth of what you're saying. Okay. That this is a poem. It's a poem written at what would be considered a doubtful moment in Iranian history. The Arab conquest has been, the Arab conquest was, long in the past. No one could possibly remember it. The Shahnameh is finished in the year 1010, by the way, and the Arab conquest is basically, the Arab conquest of Iran is basically finished, before the end of the 7th century. 651 is when the last Persian king dies. Okay. So the Shahnameh is written in Persian. It deals with all of Iranian history, beginning from the creation of the world up to the Arab conquest. And it was written in Persian at a time when the survival of the Persian language was doubtful. Everywhere else subject to the Arab conquest lost its indigenous language. Coptic is no longer spoken except by a very small minority in Egypt. The Middle East now speaks mostly Arabic.
Right.
Only in Iran did the Persian language survive. So you have this sort of reemergence amidst efforts to assimilate or to suppress Iranian culture and religion, and it all comes back in a popular. But by popular, I mean it appeals to, ordinary people on a large scale, in the form of this poem written in their indigenous language about their ancient history. It's not about Islam. It's not about Arabian things. And, this is a sort of a reassertion of Iranian nationality and culture. So what I infer from that is that in the context of what you're saying, that there are examples where, despite the efforts of rulers or tyrants or whatever, that it's impossible to keep people down. It's impossible to make people change. I think that part of the reason why the Iranian identity survived is that it was so strong to begin with, and the language itself was so strong, or the poetry. I mean, we've cited Hafez before, but there are many others.
Right.
Rudaki, Menuchehri. There are centuries worth of Persian poets, all of whom are I think drawing on Sasanian and even more ancient examples, and keeping their language alive. And in other places it might have been different forms of art, but in the Iranian world it was poetry which reasserted a national identity. So this is an example of how the kind of the efforts to keep a subjugated people down, or to basically sort of impose a new culture and a new religion, ultimately failed. So
right.
What you are describing, for the most part, I think is the rule. It's a general rule of history. But in the history of Iran, it didn't really work. And even to this day, Iranian Islam is not Orthodox Sunni Islam. It took a different course. The Iranian language still survives, even though it accommodated more and more Arabic words as time went on. But within the world that was subjugated by the Arab Caliphate, Iran stands out. In fact, what we call the Abbasid Caliphate is essentially it's an Iranianized or Persianized form of the Caliphate, established by a kind of blending of at best you could say it's like a blending of Persian and Arabic culture, but many people would say it's basically just a revival of the old Sasanian Empire in a kind of Islamic garb. And one of the strongest sort of ideological supports for it was looking back on Iranian culture and on the Zoroastrian heritage of the Sasanian Empire for models for statecraft and so forth. So even in that case, the Arab Caliphate was not able to absorb it, and that history of the Sassanid Empire sort of reasserted itself. So I hope there's some kind of an answer to your question in that long digression.
No, I've always found that so it's called. Here's our interaction as far as I can tell so far, right? So I'm in the software business, and if you were to ask me a question related to software engineering or anything of that sort, I would try to give you a contextual answer because I was trying to incorporate a significantly larger portion of what I would consider to be a good answer to fit back into to have you feeling like you were informed. Similarly, your expertise in history is such that when I ask you a question, you want to leave me informed. So you're trying to, and that's why I like when you say it's a long roundabout way. It's not what it is. It's really contextualizing the information so that it's not, because the modern world's disease is soundbite pieces, right? That's why this conversation and this podcast stands apart from everybody else, because we don't want to participate in soundbite clickbait type of answers of saying X is Y. Well, it's like, well, given A, B, C, D, and E, here's where X could potentially be Z instead of Y. And that's what we kind of appreciate here. So given your proclivities of trying to wrap context around the content, I fully applaud your approach. I thoroughly enjoy your approach. So please feel free, as you're expanding these ideas. And the question I had for you was as follows. I've noticed that the alphabet between Farsi, which is, I guess, a derivative of Persian for where I come from in Afghanistan,
Yeah.
And the Arabic the alphabet that they use in the Persians, they all sort of there's a little similar differences between them, but for the most part, 99% is essentially the same thing. My question is, before the Arabs invaded, was the Persian language as close as it is now, or was this been heavily influenced by the Arabic that brought into it? Because when I look at that and I hear what you're telling me, the first question that popped into my mind was, what happened? How was their alphabet different, or was it different? Is it just a matter of coincidence that in Saudi Arabia, the way they're writing their alphabet and the way they were doing it in Persia was essentially the same? So how do you answer that question? Like, well, what's the take on that front?
So, yeah, I mean, you're right about the similarity of the alphabets, but here's the thing. The origin of what we call the Arabic alphabet is subject to some debate, and there are traditions. There are traditions that link it with, the Nabatean script, and there are other, and I think that is probably the majority opinion of scholars. There are also traditions which suggest that at least one form of the Arabic script was developed within the Sasanian Empire by the kingdom, the Arabian kingdom that was basically subject to the Persian king in sort of northeast Arabia. They were the so-called Lakhmid Arabs, whose capital was at a place called Hira, or Al-Hira, which is near relatively close to what is now Kufa, I believe, in Iraq. Okay. In any case, that's like these are the two conflicting or two competing theories are both sort of based on legend. But the fact is that Arabic is a Semitic language. It's not linguistically connected with Persian at all. Persian is, as we said before, it's an Indo-European language. And the adaptation of the Arabic alphabet to the Persian one is kind of unusual, because in Indo-European languages you really want to write out the vowels, because they're not as predictable as they are in Semitic languages. Arabic doesn't write out its short vowels, and neither does modern Persian, because it uses the Arabic alphabet. So that's kind of unusual. I mean, it works, and it's a very attractive alphabet to use for a language like Persian, especially in calligraphy or what have you. But here's the other thing. the form of the Arabic alphabet that is now current was actually developed in Persia by a Persian grammarian, and
Wow.
I'm not sure if I'm going to get his name right. It's like Al-Sibawai or something like that. I'll have to look it up afterward because this is kind of getting out of my field, but that the original Arabic script that would have been used for, say, the earliest generations of Quranic manuscripts, for example, it's what is so-called it's the so-called Kufic script. It's a more sort of square and angular writing that doesn't have the diacritical markings or like the dots or the vowel signs. Those were all developed later. So a lot of people will refer to the Perso-Arabic alphabet because it has a sort of double influence or a double origin, and I think that there are good reasons. There are good reasons for doing so. So, to put it succinctly, the modern form of the alphabet is the result of the interaction of those two languages, Arabic and Persian. And modern Persian, whether in Iran, Farsi, or in Afghanistan, as they call it, Dari, it's basically it's basically Persian in its grammar and in a lot of its core vocabulary, with a lot of borrowed Arabic words. I think there's probably more Arabic in Farsi than there is in Afghan Persian, but they're still pretty close. I think that there are some there are like differences of accent, and maybe some words are used differently in one or the other. But for educated speakers, like I don't want to talk out of turn, but I would imagine for educated speakers that they're probably mutually intelligible. Would you agree with that?
It depends. I mean, for me, because I don't speak too much Farsi, but if a person who's Iranian speaks Persian and they slow down, I can understand them. If they speak at the speed that they would speak to each other, I get lost. It's kind of like it's hard to actually put that into experiences because some of the words share similarities, but when they're spoken really quickly, the sounds are different, right? So when I overhear them, I have Persian friends, and I always tell them, if you slow down a little bit, I can stay with you. I may lose 90% of it if you speed up, but if you slow down, I get 90% of the gist of what you're trying to say to me.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, and I would, like, for what it's worth, I would say that the kind of I've studied both, like, classical Persian and modern Persian, but for what it's worth, I would say that I find Afghan Persian much easier to understand.
Yes. My Persian friends tell me the same thing, because when I speak, no matter what speed I speak at, if I'm speaking to a friend who's speaking in Farsi, like, or Dari, they get it all. Like, they instantly go, "Oh, yeah, I know what you're talking about. I know exactly what you're saying." A few odd words here and there, but for the most part, I don't have to slow down to accommodate them listening to me. Whereas the other way around, they have to slow down for me to be able to partake in the conversation. So at your point there, I have some experience in validating that. So the other question I had for you is this, though. So if that's the case, the vast majority of Saudi Arabia and the Islamic brand that they've preached out is Sunni in nature. How come modern day Persia, or modern day Iran, is heavily, if not completely, totally Shia in terms of the Islamic branch that they've kind of incorporated into it? Is that just the person who brought it over? Was a descendant and a follower of Ali train of thought, or did they have a switch halfway through the game?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. I mean, I remember in undergrad, I took a course or two on Shi'i Islam, and it's very interesting. It's interesting that it's mostly an Iranian identity. I mean, I think Egypt is Shiite as well, but when you think about the quote unquote Shiite world, like it's really mostly Iranian. And when you think also about like the great shrines of the Shiite imams, or the, you know, quote unquote saints of Shia Islam, they're all either in Iran or near Iran, right? And the battle of Karbala, that's in what is now Iraq, but historically that was always part of Iran. It was always part of the Persian Empire. So, you know, it almost seems as though it was sort of like destined to always be a kind of Iranian identity. And again, I don't really know what explains that. But there are older theories. There are like really like 19th century ideas that suggest that Shiism is like a kind of reassertion of the old Iranian religion within Islam. So like a kind of like rebirth of Zoroastrian theology in a kind of Muslim disguise. And there are a lot of people would probably find that weird and offensive, I imagine.
Totally fun for us.
but there's a certain logic to that. I'm not saying that I agree, but I'm just saying that there's a certain logic to it. If you think about like the idea of the theory of like the emanations from God, or the various imams. If you're an Orthodox Shiite, there are 12 of them. And if you're like Ismaili or whatever, there are 7, I think, and then there are various other sects. That there's something about it that almost seems like it could be under the influence of Zoroastrianism or something. And then there are some theologians like, what is his name? Sohrawardi. I don't know if you know that guy's name. He's from your part of the world. So I think he lived in Afghanistan or somewhere in Central Asia or something like that. He was an Iranian theologian who, when you read his work, he's clearly under the influence of Zoroastrian ideas, with the idea of these. He's almost reviving the Zoroastrian idea of like the holy immortals and the emanations of the divine essence and so forth being worshipped as almost like other divinities and so forth. And unsurprisingly, he was put to death as a heretic. I forget exactly when he lived, but there's I think that there's something to the idea of some kind of earlier Iranian influence that produced what we call Shiism. But whether that means that how do I put this? It could be either that that Iranian Muslims imposed that on the religion, or that they were already inclined to favor a religion that was like that, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I hear you.
So I don't know, I don't know what came first, but there's also the notion that the Iranian world may just have wanted to be different, and that the Persian Safavid Empire, which was established in, I think, the year 1501, 1502, one of those, very early 16th century anyway, that's a response, and that was a Shiite monarchy, an officially Shiite monarchy. That's a response to the foundation of the Turkish Ottoman Empire, which was sort of aggressively Sunni. So, having the opposite, religion, or opposite sort of like, I don't know what the right word is, opposite theology within Islam would have served would have served the purpose of distinguishing this new Iranian monarchy from its biggest rival. And of course that it's really only in the 16th century that Iran becomes officially Shiite, that Shiism becomes officially patronized by a monarchy. But I don't know. I don't know what can ultimately explain it, and there's probably not only one answer, but it's very difficult to imagine. I mean, Shiite Islam has a kind of Sunni Islam nowadays has a kind of austerity to it. It's like the Wahhabist trend is one about like it's very much opposed to like popular devotion of saints, shrines, or they don't even like music very much, stuff like that. Right. It's hard to imagine that kind of thing appealing to Persians.
Right. I hear exactly what you mean.
Okay, so what are some lingering benefits of ancient Persia that we enjoy in modern times, but that people don't necessarily know is Persian roots?
So, honestly, the first thing that I would point to is just the idea of empire. Right now in human history, the idea of empire is not very popular.
Right.
but it's there were big states before Cyrus the Great. There were big states like the Akkadian Empire, or like the Hittite Empire, or whatever, and by they were big for their own time. But the Persian Empire, founded by Cyrus, is really the first international world empire. Right. With it was starting from Egypt, going all the way to the Hindu Kush mountains, right? That for the time, that was an enormous, almost unimaginably vast state, which writers like Herodotus so greatly admired, with its sort of centralized bureaucracy and its intricate system of roads, uniform coinage, and even a postal service. Herodotus was deeply impressed by the post office of the Persian Empire. And I believe that every subsequent world empire is actually inspired by that vision, and that when Alexander the Great sets out to conquer the world, he doesn't go to Europe. There was nothing in Europe. Nobody lived there. Nobody of any importance lived there. He goes to conquer the great world power of the day, which is Persia. And then on the ruins of the Persian Empire, he establishes a new world empire, right? One which doesn't really last very long, but because it quickly starts to disintegrate. But that theory of an international state where everybody lives under a common set of laws and has a common currency and so forth, that's an Iranian idea. And I would even go as far to say, I think this is highly controversial, and maybe it's going to rub everybody the wrong way. I think perfect. I think even the unification of China under the first Qin emperor, which occurs not long after Alexander's conquest, I even think that was inspired ultimately by the Persian example. Obviously, by the time China unifies itself into a single state, we're dealing with the Macedonian Empire. We're dealing with like the post Achaemenid Macedonian Empire, but I still think the principle is sound, that there were no big unitary empires before Persia, and after that, every attempt, right down to right down to the Arab conquest, and even the Ottoman the Ottoman Empire, it's still ultimately a vision of political order established by Cyrus. So I really think that's true. I know it's probably not a popular idea, but I think it's true. And I would also say that Muslim historians, like the very early Muslim historians writing in Arabic about the history of the world, they themselves had no doubt that it was ultimately that the idea of a world empire and even the caliphate and the rule of the successor to Muhammad, that it was ultimately of Persian origin, and they said so. Dinawari and Masudi and Tabari, they're very clear about the Persian origin of this. And with that in mind, we can refer back to Herodotus and say, even the idea of a centrally planned road system and a post office, those and a currency, a uniform currency for the world. Those originate with the Persian Empire. And of course, when we come to the Sasanian state, the idea, not very popular anymore, but the idea of having an established religion, having one religion, having one ruling house, one royal family, one prophet, one holy book. These were ideas that were developed there first.
I see. So I want to, because this is Risky Conversations, I want to delve into something that will definitely upset lots of people, which is what I like.
Okay.
So where I come from and where my friends who are Persian, there's always this argument as to which country did Rumi actually belong to. And they will get into heated debate. So please have your say on that matter. And for those of our listeners who don't know who Rumi is, please elaborate on what you know of him, who he is, and which country he's actually from.
Okay, so where he was born? He was born in Balkh, which is in Afghanistan.
Correct.
Right? And then he migrated, and because he was fleeing the Mongols. Or at least his family. I think he must have been a very young boy. And he arrived in what is now Konya, right? In Turkey. Under the so-called Seljuk, the rule of the Seljuk Turks. So this is why Turks, the Turkish state sometimes claims that, he's ultimately Turkish or some such thing. But, that's not really true. And of course, he passed through Iran and he wrote in Persian. So a lot of Iranians, a lot of modern day Persians will claim that he was, claim him as one of their own. But, we should never lose sight of the fact, I think, that he and his family come from what is now Afghanistan in Central Asia. Right. Central Asia, and in fact, just the restricting ourselves just to the city of Balkh itself. Balkh has produced some of the most influential people in all of human history. Zoroaster himself supposedly came from Balkh. Avicenna came from Balkh. Rumi. Who else? Thousands upon thousands of, well, maybe not thousands, dozens of great, Muslim scholars of the Golden Age lived in Balkh. It's even the famous collector of the Hadith, Ibn Balkhi. His name Ibn Balkhi. He comes from Balkh. So this obviously Rumi had to flee because of the Mongols, but Balkh is very far from being some sort of remote backwater that in its time it was the center of the world, along with the rest along with the rest of Central Asia. But we should really never, we should never lose sight of that. And, the idea of like national groups claiming that Rumi is one of theirs, that's kind of silly. But the name Rumi, it's interesting. Rumi is the word Rumi or Rum. That's the normal Arabic word, or it actually comes from Persian through Arabic. It means Roman, and it refers to the Byzantine or late Roman Empire. And the reason that it was applied to Rumi is that part of the world, which was then ruled by the Seljuk Turks, was still remembered as part of the old Roman Empire. So the Seljuk Turks often refer to themselves as the Seljuks of Rum, or the Rum Seljuk, which shows you the kind of endurance of this idea of the two great powers in the world, that Persia had fallen and was replaced by the Caliphate, and eventually that declined and others took their place. But the remnants of the old Roman Empire sort of carried on, and eventually one of the greatest Persian poets of all time had his sort of nickname derived from it. So although I think we should never forget that he came from Balkh, there's really no point in trying to make him into a Persian or a Turk or anything like that.
Well, the reason I bring that up is in my culture in Afghanistan, they actually call him Jalaluddin Balkhi, right? So that's his name, and Balkhi is because of where he was born. And the reason it becomes a source of contention for the people involved in these conversations is that they take pride in the works that the person produced, and in honor of that work, they try to reproduce their own poets. And so what ends up happening is these minor petty cultural disputes start up and saying, oh, well, what do you pretend to be like us when it's reality? So that's where they lose, sight of the actual vision of what it's all about. It's a petty thing. It's one of those weird little disputes that people have who could only understand that if they're from the particular countries involved where the dispute is sourced. But what I wanted to follow up with you on that front was this: as a person who's a student of history, as you clearly are, how does that inform your ability to advise in the current political state that you're in? Because, and I imagine being a historian in today's day and age, as bad as it was, in ancient times, there were no newspapers, as far as I know, and please correct me if I'm wrong. And of course, there was no social media, and there was no, 24-hour news. How horrible it is to be a historian in today's day and age, given the fact that we can't even agree on whether a dress was blue or gold, or if it was, I forget that audio version of it, which was, Laurel or Yanni or whatever the case may be. And so I look at this is why I find history fascinating, right? Because I'm like, okay, let's take a look at what's happening now. So your historical knowledge and your love for it sort of informs your decision, your ability to give input for the decision makers. And then you look at what will happen 1,500 years from now when, this explosion of various quote unquote fake news or my truth or subjective truth or your truth and all this alternative truth or whatever alt truth, whatever comes out. How is all that going to reconcile itself down the road? And how does it affect the way you do your job, given your context of it all?
Well, that's an excellent question. First, I have to say that I'm actually very disappointed, because when I started, getting interested in Sasanian Persia, I was interested in it for its own sake. But I also thought that, we're living at a time when the Middle East is sort of making headlines on a daily basis. And, when I first started out, the daily headline was something about, the Iranian nuclear program or whatever. And I thought, well, having some grasp of the history of the region will be useful. And, everyone's going to think that I'm an expert in something or other. And, so on and so forth. And I found that hasn't been the case. That I've not really seen much evidence that there's really deep interest in knowing more about the history of Iran or anything like that. A lot of people have shown interest in knowing more about Islam or talking about the difference between Sunni and Shiite or whatever, but I've not seen any parallel yet on developing a deep knowledge of the Iranian world. And that may be because it's just so much different, or the idea that there's some part of the world that's Muslim and not Arab is somehow difficult for people to understand. I don't know. I don't know what the reason is, but I haven't seen a great deal of interest. And I think that's a shame, because I would say that Iran is still faced with the same strategic problems now that it always had. The Iranian world and the Iranian sphere of influence is still significantly larger than the modern country of Iran itself. I mean, even Afghanistan is not part of Iran anymore, but it still has,
heavy influence.
Huge. And Central Asia too. I mean, you think about the people who now live in Central Asia, it's no longer mostly Iranian the way it was, say 1500 years ago or whatever. But culturally and religiously and linguistically, there's still an enormous amount of influence. You think about the region of the Caucasus, which Iran borders directly. Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Russia, India, Pakistan. Iran shares a border with all of these places and more. I think Iran has a border with something like more than 20 different countries. Canada has a border with 2 countries?
Right.
I don't know. Like really only one. Like it's basically for all intents and purposes. Right.
Right.
So, for us, it's a country in that situation isn't used to thinking about what is happening, in all these other different places that it borders, and having to worry about, what may happen. But any potential development in one of those places is going to be felt in Iran, and the reverse too. The most serious example that I can think of is the Iranian Revolution itself in 1979. It arguably precipitated the Russian invasion of Afghanistan, and in order to contain, as the Soviets no doubt feared, in order to contain the spread of the Shiite theocracy, and the breakdown of modern Iraq and the civil war in Syria and all the rest of it. We're seeing these events sort of rapidly unfold right now, and have been for the past 10 years, or almost 10 years. This is now that those developments have left a vacuum for Iran to expand, right? To project its influence further. And, this, to a great extent, this is determined just by the diversity of peoples that surround Iran, and which always have surrounded Iran. And the fact that geography determines that Iran has all these sort of, I don't know what the right word is, poorly defined borders, or like easily permeable borders, right? And you have the same sorts of people living on either side of a border. So that has never changed. Iran has always been like that, and the strategic difficulties that it faced, it still faces now. Third thing third thing is going back to the idea of the theory of the Iranian Empire, is that Iran, I think, if I can speak of the country as though it were a person, Iran has difficulty, I think, imagining itself just as one other country amongst all sorts of other ones. I think Canadians are used to thinking of our country as being not particularly influential or powerful, and we're one country among many, right?
Right.
But I think that the Iranian outlook is fundamentally different. That Iran itself is a world system, and if you take the political theories of the Achaemenid or Sasanian state, literally, seriously and literally, it's that Iran is the center of political and religious order in the world, and everything else, all other states, revolve around it. And if you think of, I think that the Shiite theocracy is actually very similar. That you have this idea of a divinely guided, divinely inspired guide in the form of the supreme Ayatollah, who is the representative of the 12th Imam, and that the theocracy is established in order to sort of maintain good order on earth before the return of the 12th Imam, the Mahdi, and the end of the world. That is actually not significantly different. I may say that is not significantly different from many Zoroastrian theories of world history or cosmology, and I would say that trying to fit a country like that into an international system embodied by something like the United Nations or interactions with a body like the European Union or NATO or America or whatever, that's going to be very, very difficult if that's your view of the world.
Oh, of course. So do you feel like the current rulers in Iran still have dreams of yesteryear's empires? Like, I know Putin gets told this all the time, that, he just wants to revive the great Soviet Union for what it once was, to restore it to that point. Do you feel like the current rulers of Iran have this aspiration to once again revive clearly an untenable solution in this point in history? But is that why you think they're having difficulties assimilating? Because most of the other countries tend to eventually realize the economic benefits of adapting to the new world view, whereas these guys seem to want to do a reset point to back in the day when they were, once an empire crumbles, there's always dreams of rebuilding it, right?
Well, I have to say that I don't know whether, I would say that must reflect some kind of tension within the Iranian world, whether to continue to strive for a position of regional or international leadership, or to try to take up a more modest place within within an international system.
Right.
But if you believe that your nation itself is the international system, that's going to be difficult. But I don't mean to say that the aspirations of the Iranian government are the establishment of a literal empire or a revival of the Achaemenid or Sasanian state. I just think that their view or the outlook of a people and a nation will inevitably be shaped by its history, and to an equal or possibly even greater extent by its geography, and that Iran is always going to be forced into a position of having to manage the numerous influences that surround it. And those influences are often going to be hostile, and historically almost always have been. So I'm afraid my family have returned.
No worries.
So maybe we can do one more question and call it a day, if that's all right.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So just gonna ask you two questions to finish off, and they're both kind of tied to each other. One, your top 3 or 4 historians that you recommend everybody should become familiar with, and your favorite books that would help people appreciate history more, because as we know, memories fade when history is not paid attention to. And with that, we'll call it a day.
Okay, so I would say that when you're looking at the Sasanian Empire, the two best resources that you have are the contemporary Armenian historians, the best of whom is the writer that we call Sebeos. I think we don't actually know his real name because it's only traditionally attributed to a guy called Sebeos. But that text offers a real, I think, a real view, almost as directly as you can get into the Sasanian state, from someone who was not really an outsider, but who comes from the Christian world. He was probably a bishop or somehow connected with the church, but he's writing with first-hand knowledge of the Sasanian state from the perspective of a culture which was otherwise Iranian. That's often forgotten that the Armenian world is very much within the Iranian orbit. And secondly, one of the greatest texts that you can find from the Roman world on the Sasanian Empire is the so-called History of Menander the Guardsman. And unfortunately, this text survives only in large fragments. It's been mostly lost and in some cases mutilated. But it's written from the perspective of someone who had participated in embassies between the Persian and Roman states, and he's clearly got access to documents produced by the Roman and Persian courts, to treaties signed by both powers, and he reproduces them within his text. So that's sort of, that's as close as we can get to something like a government document. However, for just sort of general sense of history, and who I think is like a great historian, everyone's going to say someone like Herodotus or Thucydides or in English someone like Gibbon. I like all of those. I greatly admire Gibbon, and I think I prefer Herodotus over Thucydides. But when it comes to ancient history, I think that the Chinese historian Sima Qian, who died, I think it's about 80 BC, something like that. He is an excellent historian. He presents accounts not just of the Chinese state, but also of the affairs of Inner Asia and the history of the nomadic peoples on the borders of China, and he's the first writer from that cultural milieu to produce a serious and rational account of the nomadic world. And he's relying on the testimony of eyewitnesses, people who actually went and lived among the nomads, chiefly amongst a people called the Xiongnu in Chinese, who may be the ancestors of the Huns. And considering if you compare him to someone like Herodotus, who is relying mostly on, hearsay and rumor, or conjecture or imagination, Sima Qian he's clearly got some documentary evidence behind him. He cites the names of his informants, as admittedly does Herodotus. But these are people who these are multiple accounts that Sima Qian is referencing, and he's analyzing them and producing an account which he thinks is the truth. It's almost like scientific history from a very, very ancient time, and he's easily overlooked amongst Western writers. And when it comes to writing a history of the period that I take an interest in, those sources on Central Asia and on the nomadic world, such as Sima Qian, are essential to a proper picture. And of course, Sima Qian, I think in the early chapters, I don't even think he mentions Iran at all. But you cannot write a good history of Iran without that perspective from the world of Central Asia and nomads, and its Chinese sources which are really top notch for doing it. So hopefully some listeners will take me seriously and look up Sima Qian for their own.
Of course. Well, we want to thank you very much for your time and your expansive amount of knowledge about the Persian history.
No, my pleasure.
Thank you so much for coming on. Is there anything else you'd like to say to our listeners before we call it a day here?
I wanna do one plug of my upcoming book.
Please.
It's called The Last Empire of Iran. It's in its final stages with the publisher. We're working on cover art and an index. The typesetting is in its final stages. It's going to be coming out probably early next year, or maybe late this year if we're lucky. And it's published by the Gorgias Press. It's going to be really the first first complete exhaustive narrative history of Sasanian Iran, published in English in the past about 150 years, I think.
Wow.
So
awesome.
It's not to be missed. It's riveting stuff. Buy yourself an advanced copy. Buy one for your friends. Anyone who needs to know about ancient Persia, this is the book for you.
Perfect. We'll definitely get the links and we'll put it up in the show notes, as well as your Twitter handle. We thank you very much for your time. Have yourself a wonderful evening.
No, you too. It's a pleasure. Thanks.
We hope you enjoyed this episode as much as we have. The truth is, any conversation worthy of having will inherently be a risky one.
Thank you for listening. Stay anti-fragile and carry on the ancient tradition and your own unique way of saying what only you can say and doing what only you can do. Abiding by Milton's words, this is Ember Sadat and Ace Deliri signing off, wishing you the very best of worthy and risky conversations.